On the sweltering night of July 4th, 1833, while Charleston's white elite celebrated their freedom with champagne and fireworks, 12 plantation masters sat down to what they believed would be another decadent feast. They raised their glasses to liberty, to prosperity, to the divine order that kept them wealthy and others in chains. But as they lifted those crystal goblets, none of them realized they were toasting their own deaths. By dawn, all 12 lay sprawled across the polished mahogany floors of the Whitaker estate, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and agony. No musket balls had torn through their flesh. No knives had found their hearts. Instead, death had come disguised as hospitality, seasoned into their favorite dishes by hands they trusted but never truly saw. Before we begin tonight's story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories. The killer's name was Samuel. For 23 years, he had cooked for the very men who bought and sold human beings like livestock. He had served meals to those who tore children from their mother's arms, who laughed as whips split open backs, who treated human suffering as casual entertainment. But Samuel possessed something his tormentors never expected from a slave: the memory of an elephant and the patience of a predator. The son of an African medicine woman, Samuel understood that some leaves kill slowly, silently, mercifully. Too frail for the brutal labor of rice fields, he had been relegated to the kitchen, where the masters believed he could do no harm. They were catastrophically wrong. In that kitchen, Samuel didn't just learn recipes, he learned secrets. He discovered that every man who claimed to own him had weaknesses: favorite foods that could mask bitter tastes, chronic ailments that could explain sudden deaths, and guilty consciences that made them vulnerable to a justice they never saw coming. For 10 excruciating years, Samuel planned his revenge with the precision of a master chef preparing a 7-course meal. He studied each target like a scholar, memorizing their habits, their health problems, their culinary preferences. He cultivated a secret garden of beautiful killers: oleander, foxglove, castor beans, flowers that could stop hearts while looking innocent as Sunday morning. But here's what makes Samuel's story truly extraordinary. He didn't just murder 12 men. He executed a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice, where each death was specifically tailored to the crimes of its victim. Every plate told a story. Every bite delivered a verdict. This isn't just a tale of poison and revenge. It's the story of how an enslaved man transformed the most mundane act, preparing a meal, into the most powerful weapon imaginable. It's about how knowledge, memory, and unshakable determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. And before we dive deeper into this incredible true story, I want you to imagine something. What would you do if everything you loved was systematically destroyed by people who saw you as property? How far would you go to seek justice when the law itself was designed to protect your oppressors? Keep that question in mind as we uncover the extraordinary life of Samuel, the cook who proved that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with armies, but with a single person who refuses to forget. Let me take you back to a time when human beings were bought and sold like cattle, to a plantation where cruelty was as common as morning coffee, and to a kitchen where one man quietly prepared the most consequential meal in American history. The bodies were still warm when Charleston's summer sun dared to pierce the morning clouds. 12 of South Carolina's most prominent men lay scattered across the opulent dining room of the Whitaker plantation, like broken dolls discarded by an angry child. Judge Hartley, who had sentenced countless slaves to death for minor infractions, lay face down in his beloved candied figs, his judicial robes soaked with vomit and bile. Reverend Cole, who preached that slavery was God's will while personally owning 47 human beings, clutched his throat where no prayer could reach. Master Edwin Whitaker himself, the lord of this particular hell, had collapsed into his pork belly, the very dish he'd praised moments before it killed him. The scene defied explanation. These weren't random deaths. Each man had succumbed to different symptoms: heart failure, respiratory collapse, violent convulsions, yet all had died within the same fateful hour. Some had tried to flee, leaving trails of blood and vomit across Persian rugs worth more than most people's entire lives. Others had simply dropped where they sat, as if an invisible hand had reached out and claimed them. Outside, the enslaved workers gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces masks of careful neutrality. They had heard the screams echoing from the big house. They had seen the frantic shadows dancing behind the windows, but not one of them called for help. Not one of them ran to fetch a doctor. They simply watched and waited, because they understood something the constables would never grasp. What they were witnessing wasn't a tragedy. It was a reckoning, 20 years in the making. In the center of this carnage stood Samuel, still wearing his cook's apron, still holding the wooden spoon he'd used to stir the final sauces. His back was straight, his eyes clear, his hands steady. When the local sheriff burst through the doors with 3 armed deputies, expecting to find a scene of chaos and panic, he instead found something far more unsettling: absolute calm. "Samuel," the sheriff's voice cracked like a whip in the silence. "Did you do this?" For a long moment, the only sound was the grandfather clock in the corner, still ticking away the seconds, as if nothing had changed. Samuel slowly turned his head, and when he looked at the sheriff, it was with the steady gaze of a man who had made peace with his choices long ago. "They died free," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "just like they always said they wanted to be." Those 5 words sent a chill through every white man in that room, because they suddenly realized they were standing in the presence of someone who had spent years listening to their conversations, learning their secrets, and planning something none of them had been clever enough to anticipate. But to understand how Samuel reached this moment, how a slave became an executioner, how a kitchen became a courtroom, how food became a weapon of mass destruction, need to travel back in time and across an ocean to a place where healing and harming were 2 sides of the same coin, long before there were plantations, before there were slave ships, before there was a Charleston harbor filled with human cargo. There was a river in West Africa where a woman named Nafula practiced the ancient art of medicine. She was what her people called a root worker, someone who could read the language of plants and understand the delicate balance between life and death that existed in every leaf, every seed, every drop of tree sap. Nafula's hands were never idle. During the day she gathered herbs in woven baskets, her keen eyes distinguishing between plants that could heal a fever and those that could stop a heart. At night, by the light of palm oil lamps, she ground roots into powders, boiled bark into teas, and prepared remedies that could cure ailments or, when necessity demanded, ensure that cruel men never harmed anyone again. In her village, everyone knew that Nafula's garden contained both salvation and damnation, often growing side by side in the same soil. Children were taught to recognize her healing plants, but they were also warned about the deadly ones that grew in the shadows. Beautiful flowers that could kill with a kiss, innocent-looking berries that could end a life with a single bite. Samuel was born during the rainy season, when thunder rolled across the sky like the voices of angry ancestors. He emerged into the world without crying, which Nafula took as a sign that he had already heard enough of the world's suffering while in her womb. From his earliest days, he possessed an unusual stillness, a watchful quality that made him seem older than his years. While other children played games and chased chickens, Samuel followed his mother through the forest, learning to identify plants by their smell, their texture, the way sunlight fell across their leaves. Nafula taught him that every plant had a purpose, every root had a power, and every person who sought to control others through violence was vulnerable to the quiet wisdom of those who understood nature's secrets. "The body is a river," she would tell him as they gathered medicinal herbs, "and whoever controls what flows into that river controls life and death itself. The powerful think they own everything, but they never consider that their next meal might be their last." Samuel absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts. By the age of 8, he could identify deadly nightshade by moonlight, distinguish between safe mushrooms and those that would cause hallucinations, and prepare poultices that could either heal wounds or hide the evidence of how they were made. But Nafula taught him more than botanical knowledge. She taught him patience. "Revenge," she would say, "is a dish that must be prepared slowly, with careful attention to every ingredient. Rush the process and you ruin everything. Take your time and you create something that will be remembered forever." Samuel was 10 years old when the slave raiders came. They arrived like a plague of locusts, armed with muskets and chains, seeking human cargo to feed the insatiable appetite of New World plantations. The night they took him, Samuel watched his mother fight like a lioness protecting her cub, using every weapon she could find: kitchen knives, boiling water, even her bare hands, but there were too many of them. As they dragged him toward the ships, Samuel saw Nafula one last time. She was bleeding from a head wound, but her eyes were still fierce, still defiant. With her last free breath, she called out to him in their native language, "Remember what I taught you. Remember who you are, and when the time comes, make them. Remember too." The middle passage was a floating hell that defied description. Hundreds of human beings packed into a space meant for cargo, chained together in their own filth, breathing air thick with disease and despair. Samuel watched strong men break down weeping. He saw women lose their minds rather than face another day of this nightmare. He witnessed children die from diseases that had no names. But Samuel didn't break. Instead, he remembered his mother's final words and began to plan. Even as a child, he understood that survival required more than just staying alive. It required staying alert, staying angry, and most importantly, staying ready for the moment when justice would finally be possible. Nafula died during that voyage, her body claimed by fever and grief. One morning, Samuel woke to find the chain that connected them swinging empty, her wrist shackle hanging open like a broken promise. They had thrown her overboard during the night, another casualty of the Atlantic slave trade, another name that would never be recorded in any history book. When the ship finally reached Charleston, Samuel was 11 years old, alone in a foreign land and filled with a rage so pure it burned like molten iron in his chest. The auction block was a theater of human degradation, where buyers examined teeth, muscles, and scars like they were purchasing livestock. Samuel was small for his age, too frail for field work, which initially made him less valuable than the bigger, stronger captives. But Edwin Whitaker saw something different when he looked at the quiet boy with the watchful eyes. He saw potential, not for heavy labor but for domestic service. Whitaker needed someone to help in the kitchen, someone who could follow instructions without causing trouble, someone who would be invisible enough to overhear conversations but smart enough to be useful. He bought Samuel for $37.50, roughly the same price as a decent horse. It was the worst investment Whitaker ever made, though he wouldn't realize it for another 23 years. The Whitaker plantation was a monument to wealth built on the backs of human suffering. The main house rose from manicured grounds like a white-columned temple to American prosperity, its rooms filled with furniture carved from mahogany trees and decorated with silver purchased with blood money. Behind the house, the kitchen stood like a separate building, connected by a covered walkway that allowed the wealthy to enjoy their meals without having to see or smell the brutal work that produced them. Samuel's new world was a realm of fire and iron, where massive hearths burned day and night, where cast iron pots large enough to bathe a child bubbled with stews that fed dozens of people, where the air was thick with smoke, steam, and the constant pressure of preparing meals for those who held the power of life and death. The kitchen was ruled by Miss Gertie, a freed woman who had earned her liberty through years of culinary excellence, but remained trapped by economic necessity. She was a complicated figure, legally free but practically enslaved, respected for her skills but despised for her skin color. The tension between her legal status and social reality had twisted her into something bitter and hard, a woman who took out her frustrations on those beneath her in the plantation hierarchy. Miss Gertie taught Samuel the basics of cooking, but she taught him cruelty as well. She slapped him when the bread burned. She kicked him when he peeled vegetables too slowly. She screamed at him when he accidentally dropped plates or spilled precious ingredients. But she also taught him something invaluable: how to observe the masters without being seen, how to listen to conversations while appearing focused on his work, how to become so invisible that people forgot he had eyes and ears. Watch them eat, she would whisper to Samuel when they were alone in the kitchen. Food tells you everything about a person: what they love, what they hate, what makes them sick, what keeps them healthy. A good cook knows these things because it's how you keep your job. But a smart cook remembers these things because you never know when that information might save your life. Samuel absorbed these lessons with the intensity his mother had taught him to bring to every form of learning. He began to catalog the eating habits, food preferences, and digestive weaknesses of every white person who entered the Whitaker house. Judge Hartley loved sweets but couldn't digest dairy. Reverend Cole preferred rich, creamy sauces but suffered from chronic stomach problems. Master Whitaker himself had a weakness for fatty pork, but complained constantly about heartburn and liver pain. At first, Samuel simply filed away this information as survival knowledge, but as months turned to years, as he witnessed countless acts of casual cruelty, as he watched his fellow enslaved people sold, beaten, raped, and murdered, this knowledge began to transform in his mind from mere observations into something more: dangerous intelligence that could be weaponized. The transformation began slowly. Samuel started requesting permission to tend a small garden behind the kitchen, claiming he wanted to grow herbs and vegetables to improve the meals he prepared. Miss Gertie supported the request because fresh ingredients would make her look better to the masters, and Master Whitaker approved it because anything that improved the quality of his food was worthwhile. But Samuel's garden was unlike any other on the plantation. Yes, he grew tomatoes and onions, sage and thyme, all the normal plants you would expect from a kitchen garden. But hidden among the innocent vegetables, carefully disguised as decorative flowers or useful herbs, Samuel began cultivating a different kind of crop altogether. He grew foxglove, beautiful purple flowers that could stop a heart if prepared correctly. He cultivated castor beans, which produced an oil that was useful for many things but also contained ricin, one of nature's most potent poisons. He nurtured oleander bushes, whose lovely pink blossoms concealed leaves so toxic that a single one, properly prepared, could kill a grown man. Samuel had learned these secrets from his mother, but he refined them through careful experimentation. Working late at night when everyone else was asleep, he tested different preparation methods on rats that plagued the kitchen, on stray dogs that wandered onto the plantation, on any creature that could serve as a guinea pig for his research. He learned which plants killed quickly and which took hours to work. He discovered how to mask bitter tastes in sweet sauces, how to concentrate toxins without destroying their potency, how to prepare doses that would mimic natural deaths. But knowledge without opportunity is useless, and Samuel understood that his chance for justice might never come. So he waited, patient as his mother had taught him to be, watching and learning and preparing for a moment that might never arrive. That moment finally came on a humid afternoon in July, when Master Whitaker announced that he would be hosting a special dinner party to celebrate American independence. 12 of the most prominent plantation owners in South Carolina would be gathering at the Whitaker estate for an evening of fine food, expensive wine, and self-congratulatory speeches about freedom and liberty. As Samuel listened to the guest list, Judge Hartley, Reverend Cole, Colonel Wexley, Dr. Miles, and 8 other pillars of Charleston society, he realized that fate had just presented him with something extraordinary, the opportunity to serve justice to every single man who had played a role in destroying his life and the lives of countless others. The planning began immediately. Samuel had exactly 2 weeks to prepare the most important meal of his life, and every detail had to be perfect. Not just perfect enough to impress the guests, but perfect enough to kill them all without raising suspicion until it was too late. For Judge Hartley, who had sentenced dozens of slaves to death for crimes as minor as learning to read, Samuel planned candied figs laced with foxglove extract. The judge's well-known sweet tooth and his equally well-known heart problems would provide the perfect cover story for his demise. For Reverend Cole, who preached that slavery was divinely ordained while personally profiting from human trafficking, Samuel prepared oyster stew enriched with castor bean extract. The Reverend's chronic digestive problems would explain his violent death throes as a tragic but natural consequence of his delicate constitution. For Colonel Wexley, who had made his fortune capturing runaway slaves and returning them to their owners for bounties, Samuel chose monkshood mixed into his favorite, tobacco. The Colonel's habit of chewing tobacco throughout meals would ensure the poison entered his system quickly and lethally. Each target received a personally crafted death sentence, designed around their specific vulnerabilities and guilty consciences. Samuel spent weeks perfecting the timing, the dosages, the presentation. He practiced every gesture, every movement, every expression he would need to maintain his facade of innocent servitude while serving justice disguised as hospitality. But Samuel's plan went beyond simple murder. He wanted these men to understand in their final moments exactly what was happening to them and why. He wanted them to realize that their deaths weren't random accidents or divine judgments, but the inevitable consequence of treating human beings like disposable property. Most importantly, Samuel wanted his fellow enslaved people to witness the moment when the seemingly powerless gained ultimate power over those who had oppressed them. He wanted them to see that resistance was possible, that justice could be served even in the most hopeless circumstances, that knowledge and patience could triumph over brutality and ignorance. On the morning of July 4th, 1833, Samuel rose before dawn and began the most important work of his life. He prepared each dish with the care of an artist creating a masterpiece, the precision of a surgeon performing a delicate operation, and the devotion of a priest offering a sacred ritual to the gods of justice. As the sun set and the guests arrived, in their finest carriages, dressed in their most expensive clothes, laughing and joking about their prosperity and freedom, Samuel put the finishing touches on his deadly feast. He arranged each plate like a work of art, knowing that these would be the last meals these men would ever enjoy. The irony was perfect. On America's Independence Day, 12 men who had built their fortunes on denying freedom to others would discover what it truly meant to be liberated. Liberated from life itself, liberated by the hands of someone they had never bothered to see as fully human. As the guests took their seats around the mahogany table, raising their glasses in toast to liberty and prosperity, Samuel began serving them their final judgment. And with each plate he placed, with each dish he presented, he was not just feeding their bodies. He was feeding their souls to the ancestors they had wronged, offering them as a sacrifice to the spirits of every enslaved person who had died under the lash, every child who had been sold away from their family, every woman who had been brutalized, every man who had been worked to death in the fields. The meal began exactly as Master Whitaker had planned, a celebration of American values, a testament to Southern prosperity, a demonstration of the natural order that kept white men in power and black bodies in bondage. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, with jokes about disobedient slaves, complaints about abolitionists, and boasts about profitable harvests built on unpaid labor. But Samuel knew something they didn't. This wasn't a dinner party. It was a trial, and he was not the servant. He was the judge, the jury, and the executioner all rolled into one. And the verdict had already been decided 23 years ago, when a 10-year-old boy watched his mother die in the belly of a slave ship. Judge Hartley was the first to die, which was fitting since he had presided over so many death sentences himself. The foxglove worked exactly as Samuel had calculated, sending the judge into cardiac arrest just as he was reaching for his third candied fig. He collapsed face first into his dessert plate, his judicial robes spreading around him like the wings of a fallen angel. The other guests initially thought the judge had simply had too much to drink, but their laughter died in their throats when Reverend Cole began clutching his stomach and moaning in agony. The castor bean extract was working its way through his system, causing internal bleeding that would kill him within minutes. One by one, they began to understand that something was terribly wrong. Colonel Wexley started coughing up blood from the monk's hood in his tobacco. Dr. Miles, despite all his medical knowledge, couldn't diagnose what was happening fast enough to save himself from the belladonna Samuel had mixed into his brandy. Panic erupted around the dining table as the cream of Charleston society realized they were dying. Some tried to run, but the poisons were already in their bloodstreams, shutting down their organs, stopping their hearts, filling their lungs with fluid. Others attempted to vomit up what they had consumed, but it was far too late for such simple remedies. Through it all, Samuel stood quietly in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, watching his life's work unfold with the satisfaction of a man who had kept a promise made to his dying mother. He didn't gloat or celebrate. He simply observed, cataloging the final moments of men who had lived their entire lives believing they were untouchable. When the last of the 12 had drawn his final breath, Samuel removed his apron, folded it carefully, and sat down in Master Whitaker's chair at the head of the table. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. Not because he had escaped slavery, but because he had proven that even the most powerful oppressors were vulnerable to the quiet determination of those they underestimated. The constables found him there an hour later, sitting calmly among the corpses, making no attempt to flee or hide what he had done. When they demanded an explanation, Samuel gave them the truth in words as simple and devastating as his actions had been. They lived by selling freedom, he said. Tonight I gave them a taste of what they had been serving all along. The trial that followed was a foregone conclusion in a society built on white supremacy and black subjugation. No white jury was going to acquit a slave of murdering 12 prominent citizens, regardless of the circumstances that drove him to such desperate measures. But Samuel's trial became something unexpected, a public examination of the very institution of slavery itself. Samuel never denied what he had done. Instead, he used his time in court to force Charleston's elite to confront the logical consequences of their own cruelty. When the prosecutor called him a monster, Samuel replied that monsters were made, not born, and asked the jury to consider what kind of society created conditions that drove human beings to such extremes. When they sentenced him to death, Samuel showed no fear or regret. He had accomplished what he set out to do, and he was prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. But his execution would not be the end of his story. If anything, it was just the beginning. Word of Samuel's actions spread through the slave communities of the South like wildfire. Suddenly, every cook, every kitchen worker, every person who prepared food for their oppressors became a potential threat in the minds of the white elite. Plantation owners began hiring food tasters, supervising meal preparation, and living in constant fear that their next dinner might be their last. Samuel had accomplished something remarkable. He had transformed the act of cooking from a symbol of servitude into a symbol of resistance. He had shown that knowledge, patience, and determination could triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds. Most importantly, he had proven that no oppressor, no matter how powerful, was immune to justice when it came from an unexpected source, on thou. The morning of his execution, Samuel walked to the gallows with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his life. He declined the traditional last meal, saying he had already eaten everything he needed to eat. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke directly to the enslaved people who had gathered to witness his death. "They want you to believe you are powerless," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "But I have shown you that power comes not from chains or whips or laws, but from knowledge, memory, and the refusal to accept injustice. Remember what I have done, and remember that you are never as helpless as they want you to believe." The rope took his life, but it could not kill his legacy. Samuel's story became legend among the enslaved, a tale passed down through generations of people who found hope in the knowledge that resistance was possible, that justice could be served, even in the most oppressive circumstances. In kitchens across the South, cooks began growing their own secret gardens, learning their own botanical lessons, preparing their own quiet forms of resistance. They may not have followed Samuel's exact path, but they carried forward his essential message: that knowledge is power, that patience can triumph over brute force, and that even the most downtrodden person possesses the capacity to change history. 3. White elite tried to erase Samuel from the official records, to pretend that his actions were an aberration, rather than an inevitable consequence of their own brutality. But they couldn't silence the whispers in slave quarters, the songs that carried his story from plantation to plantation, the quiet conversations that kept his memory alive. Samuel had wanted more than revenge. He had wanted recognition that enslaved people were fully human, capable of complex thought and sophisticated planning, deserving of justice and respect. In achieving his revenge, he had forced an entire society to confront uncomfortable truths about the institution they defended so fiercely. Today, more than a century and a half later, Samuel's story remains relevant because it speaks to fundamental questions about justice, resistance, and the lengths to which oppressed people will go when legal remedies are unavailable. His actions were extreme, but they emerged from extreme circumstances, a society that legally sanctioned the ownership, abuse, and murder of human beings. Samuel proved that intelligence and determination can overcome almost any disadvantage, that the supposedly powerless often possess forms of power their oppressors never anticipate. He demonstrated that resistance can take many forms, from the dramatic gesture to the quiet accumulation of knowledge that eventually becomes a weapon, more deadly than any gun or sword. Most importantly, Samuel's story reminds us that history is full of unnamed heroes who fought injustice in whatever ways they could, using whatever tools they had available. He may have been a cook, but he was also a strategist, a chemist, a historian who used his intimate knowledge of his oppressors to turn their own appetites against them. In the end, Samuel achieved a form of immortality that his victims never attained. Their names are forgotten footnotes in history books, but his story continues to inspire anyone who faces seemingly impossible odds. He proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not violence but patience. The patience to watch, to learn, to wait for the perfect moment to serve justice on a silver platter. The kitchen where Samuel worked still stands, though it has been converted into a museum that tells a sanitized version of plantation life. Tour guides speak of gracious living and Southern hospitality, but they rarely mention the man who proved that hospitality can be a mask for justice, and that the most dangerous person in any house might be the one who controls what goes on your plate. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of Samuel's garden behind that kitchen. Oleander bushes still bloom there, their beautiful pink flowers swaying in the Carolina breeze, a living memorial to a man who understood that sometimes the most profound truths are hidden in the most beautiful lies. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, they say you can still hear Samuel's voice, whispering to anyone brave enough to listen. Remember what I taught you. Remember who you are, and when the time comes, make them remember too.